Now it's recording. So get a piece of paper. People that are here, I've got blank paper up front you can come fetch. People at home, I guess if you can run like Flash, you could come and get a piece of paper, but get something and you're going to hot dog it and you're going to hamburger it. So you have 4 boxes on each side. Okay. Purposely, you have little space because I want you to go from being it's on the screen, so I must write it down, to try to capture the big picture items that define each of these time periods, because we're going to be going over both questions and time periods at the same time. Okay. Some questions in the chat. We can do the multiple choice in any order between now and the test, right? Right. You can do them in any order. So let's say your plan that you made, your weakness was unit 7. So you want to tackle unit 7 now. You can. At the end of it all, I'll look and make sure you have all 9 of those tests done before I stick the average in hack. Okay, because you made your own personal plan and it might be in a different order than mine. My Canvas directions are just reminding you, if you go in order, tonight is this, tomorrow night is that, because some don't think about today versus tomorrow. They just meander and wander. So now there's another question. Are the AP classroom assignments an accuracy grade? Not even 2 minutes ago, I highlighted the very generous scale that said if you get 25% or less right, you get a 70. So go back in Canvas and read, and you'll see how I'm scaling those AP Classroom multiple choice questions. Another question popping up in the chat is we don't have to follow our plan exactly, right? That's counterintuitive. You made the plan. Why would you disagree with yourself? Do I know if you're following your plan exactly? No. But the plan is a plan so you can get from point A to point B. So don't just make it and then do nothing. If you need to adjust it as you're going, sure, that's fine. Okay, so back to this. On your piece of paper, you're going to be on the top row of the front side. Unit 1, global tapestry, and then along the very top, the years 1200 to 1450. I want you to put the titles of these units because the titles are descriptive on purpose, and in some sense, they're the ultimate macro review, because if you can understand what those titles of the units are, then you'll get the major concept of theme of that unit. Okay. So on the top row, you got global tapestry, 1200 to 1450. And then on the top right, unit 2, networks of exchange. And then below the hot dog fold on the first page, on the left, you have unit 3, land empires. In the middle, you have the time period 1450 to 1750. And in the middle right, you have unit 4, transoceanic interconnections. Lots of syllables in those 2 words. And then when you flip the bad boy over, along the top, unit 5, revolutions. Along the middle top, 1750 to 1900. Then unit 6, consequences of industrialization. And then the middle back to the left, unit 7, global conflict. The dates, 1900 to now in the middle bottom. And then you want unit 8, Cold War and decolonization. And then because it's 8 and not 9 blocks, just throw globalization somewhere down the bottom, you'll have space. I think what you'll find today as we go through these periods, that the most recent things are the most that you remember. And that makes sense because you're human. And it's going to be the top or the front page, really, units 1 through 4, where things are the most vague. And that's why we're doing this. So I'll give you the kind of the big picture of each, narrowing down to the questions you didn't get. And in the next 3 days, when you're working on your review plan, that's when you're dialing down, digging deeper into specifics in each time period. I'm kind of judging by how people are drawing in the class when they're done. It's one thing I remember from your many times on big Post-it notes doing colored rectangles. Remember those things? Those rectangles sometimes took you longer than actually reading the stuff that the rectangles were for. It's the GT perfectionist. I must have lines straighter than nature, or else I'm inferior. So I'll give you a brief pause to do this. And again, this is being recorded and I'll stick it on Canvas. And when we start going forward, there's going to be a lot of images that have lots of words and pictures on them. Don't think you have to be master interpreter and start writing everything down from these images. Listen to my word flow, get what I'm emphasizing, and then you'll start to figure out, oh, this would be something I should write down. Everybody takes notes a little differently. The small space is to force you to focus on the important versus all the minutia around it. Nyla's still drawing lines, so I'm judging her. Oh, she's almost done. Globalization. How about Naya, now that she can see again? All right. So we're going to flash back to your freshman year, the fall of your freshman year, that time when you were young and impressionable and scared of things heritage. And you entered the humanities room with the big bad sophomores looking at you as freshmen with that tone. And then we did this for 18 weeks. You probably don't remember this. Here's the good. The AP test starts with content that's smack dab in the middle, 1200 to 1450. The first 4 weeks of your confused ninth grade humanities existence is not tested. But there was a point behind that. What other people don't get who take the normal 1 year WAP, or what I lovingly call B team, they don't get any of the context for what's happening. They just jump into, here's East Asia, here's the Islamic world, whoop, here's South Asia, here's the Americas. And we're like, what? And they get lost in this kind of, what do we just dump right in the middle of history for? We started at the beginning to look at, in each of those regions, what was the classical foundation of it? What patterns existed with the way states were created and cultural developments. And we did that with the Mediterranean world, looking at Greece and Rome. So you remember Oedipus Rex, these flashbacks happening, Greek columns, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. No, what are you talking about? I flushed that from my brain. COVID made me forget. It was there. Okay. So these patterns don't pop out of nowhere in this thing called the global tapestry. But the reason AP named it this kind of dumb name, to be honest, like what does that have to do with a rug? But what they're trying to color with this unit is there's going to be lots of various differentiated cultures. So think of a tapestry with lots of different qualities. But what's going to be on that tapestry are those kind of foundational characteristics around what kind of states are created and belief systems and how they influence those states. So you guys had a deeper dive into what the rest of the world in B team took about 4 weeks on. So when you see something like this and go, good God, with just names flooding all over the place and print so small you can't read it, thinking, I can't remember all that stuff. First off, this period, Unit 1, Global Tapestry, 1200 to 1450, is never more than 10% of the entire test. It'll never be a long essay question topic that you have to write. And really long essay topics are the hardest because all the info has to come from your brain. There's no stimulus, there's no documents. So they don't take the very first thing you do your freshman year and base your entire AP score around it. But there will be some things. So what some things should you emphasize? And these are the titles that they give the subunits in Global Tapestry. You need to be understanding what these regions are. So when you see Dar al-Islam and go, what in the world does that mean? It means the Islamic world, which is all this stuff in orange. And then we'll dive deeper into that later. Okay. We're going to focus just on the patterns in East Asia because that's what the questions were on the mock test. But the ones on the left and then Europe are usually the ones that are more tested. The Americas and Africa in this time period always get short shift. They're not tested as much. If you really come down to needing just two things to do, and I like three when I think of three, I like cramming for three. I would do East Asia, Dar al Islam, and Europe. Sorry, South Asian pride. You've been dumped. Remember, this is about in game scoring, and these are the three that are usually the most tested. Okay. So, all these details that are up here, I would not waste my time trying to do them all because, again, it's no more than 8 to 10% of the total test. I would spend some time reminding yourself about Chinese dynasties and patterns. So, when we're thinking of what to write down, make sure you remember this idea of the mandate of heaven and the dynastic cycle. It's historic time, political patterns in East Asia, starts in China, but they're adopted and adapted in the other East Asian nations. And in case you're forgetting what is East Asia, it's China, Japan, Korea. So the cycle is the explanation of how the heavens or religion, the deities, give the mandate or the permission for a dynasty to rule the land. As long as the dynasty is doing these things, bringing peace, public works, honoring the peasantry, and protecting the people, then they have the mandate. When we talk about Confucianism in a second, this is a very Confucian pattern. It's about order and stability. It's about rulers doing their role, so then their subjects do their role, and then we have harmony. What the mandate tries to explain is that whenever times get chaotic, the reason for it is the dynasty is not upholding its role now. It's doing too much bad to the people, like taxing them. It's not protecting them. Public works are decreasing, declining. And therefore, the dynasty now loses the mandate of heaven. It's not a real thing. There's no meeting between the gods and the emperor and, oh, you're out. But it's a mindset or a way to rationalize to the people why one dynasty can go away. And the signal to the people that this dynasty loses favor are natural disasters, revolts, outside invasions, and lawlessness. And then that signals a competition's on, a new dynasty emerges. And that's when you get the nice dynasty song set to Verajaka. Remember that from your freshman year? Right. Now for you, lucky, there's only 3 of the early dynasties that are testable. We looked earlier in that. We went back to the Han, the Tang, but they're not going to start until the Song dynasty. And then the Yuan, if you remember, is the Mongols. And then there's only 2 after that, the Ming, which actually spans into later units, and then the last one, the Qing. Okay. And then the little bit outside of China that's important, I work for Koreans, so I'm not going to disparage Korean history, but it's really not a big part of the test. But there could be, like you saw in the mock, some Japanese history in this period. Okay. And the type of dynastic system that develops in Japan is they attempt to be like the Chinese for a time, as you'll see from the first 3 questions on the mock. But instead, they devolve into a military state ruled by what's called a shogun. And the shogun is a general. He's the leading samurai who's kicked butt of other samurai, and then his dynasty is in charge until another shogunate rises because they kick his butt. So it's a cycle of sorts, but it's an adapted version of the Chinese. Okay. So you noticed up here on Song, the word Neo-Confucianism. So we need to talk about what that is, because that could be something testable on the test. Kind of redundant, right? Testable on the test. So let's see if you remember much about your freshman year in East Asia, if you can remember what these 3 isms are in China. So there's a little parable about pickles. I have no idea why it's pickles. I don't think of a pickle as being something very Chinese. But I want you to read the Buddhist pickle thing The vinegar is bitter only by not desiring a pickle can one eliminate the bitterness. And someone mic on and tell me what Buddhist ideas are in that little quote. What do you remember about Buddhism? With your microphone, please.
Desire leads to suffering.
Right. So to end desire, what do we do? I mean, to end suffering, what do we do?
We eliminate desires.
Right. So it's a very anti-materialistic philosophy. Materialism, human greed, that's what causes suffering. So we want to live a life of moderation because we're trying to achieve this state of release from worldly desires, nirvana. Okay. Of the three, Buddhism is the one that's foreign, that comes from India. It's the one that comes last. So I'm going to save the hardest one, Taoism, for last. And I want to go to the one that's the most influential, because when we talk about Neo-Confucianism in a minute, it's not called Neo-Buddhism. So if it's called Neo-Confucianism, it's saying that of the three, this one's more important. So same idea. The vinegar is sour. We must teach the correct recipe in order to make proper pickles. What's Confucian about this pickle quote? Let me hear from you, Zoom land, or in-person Zoom land.
In like Confucianism, they have to follow like a set like rules or laws they have to follow.
Okay, so it's very much about following rules, knowing your proper role. So what is emphasized in order to know these rules and roles?
Education.
Right, education, the scholar, because the scholar is the one who could best communicate these proper roles and rituals. And then if everyone's doing their part, then there's balance and stability. So it's a very hierarchical structured belief system, because it does say that there are different roles for different people based on age, gender, class. So it creates hierarchical power structures, men over women, old over young, father over son, husband over wife, emperor over people. And that's acceptable because it brings harmony. It keeps the dynastic cycle on the good side. It's only when people aren't following their roles that the dynasty goes to the bad side. Okay. So then we have Taoism. It's all good. Sure, the vinegar is both sour and bitter, but this is the way nature intends pickles to taste. So what do you remember about Taoism in that quote? Think about what's being emphasized.
It's always about nature's desire and the worldly things the world provides us.
I heard part of the beginning, nature oriented, nature's.
Yeah, nature's desire, and it's all about like the world, what the world gives us and what the world wants for us.
Right. So it's almost like this kind of fated thing that your role is just to follow it, follow the path. Nature's the model. Man's insignificant. So if you think back to some of the art we looked at, whenever it was a giant landscape with an insignificant human and the mountains seemed to be alive, it was that Taoist idea about the power of nature, the energy in all of us, what's called the chi. And in your non-boomer minds, think to Star Wars and the ideas of the Force and that life force. That's where it comes from. George Lucas studying these Eastern philosophies and Taoism. So like Tai Chi and those people doing those slow motions when they're trying to capture movement and energy, that's where it comes from. Taoism is very individualistic and mystical. Confucianism is very public and communal. And in some sense, that's where you get the yin yang, the public and the private, the individual and the group. And there's a lot of stuff on the screen. This is an actual screenshot of when I was kind of doing on that document cam with you guys last year. So you don't want to write everything down. What you want to know is that in the global tapestry time period, 1200 to 1450, those three isms had been in China for centuries. And there's an attempt in the Song dynasty, late Tang, early Song, to fuse them together to create one belief versus three, but to make them kind of balanced. Now, the title itself is not balanced because it's New Confucianism. It's not New Taoism. But what the Confucians, who are always in control, do is they integrate some aspects of Buddhism and some aspects of Taoism to bring that unity together. Okay, so Neo-Confucian ideology is the ideology that is still talking about proper roles, hierarchies, things of that nature, but it emulates the Buddhist Bodhisattva as a Confucian teacher, teaching you Buddhism as another path to follow, another thing you can learn to have a better life, or using Taoist concepts of what nature's power is and energy, and then the Taoist teacher, and you learn the Taoist way, because Taoism is an explanation of nature's role and humans' role. So Taoism would say nature, man, nature more powerful, man inferior, subordinate, but it's still a unified whole. So Neo-Confucianism is the fusion of the three faiths. Comes out of China during the Song dynasty. So now we get to the test portion of it, like reviewing some items. The first three questions were about this small little thing that's probably too tiny if you have a small screen. It was a Japanese constitution from this time, from an early time period. And each of those passages would represent a Chinese influence. They talk about Buddhist ideas, they talk about proper roles. And what the third question was, which was, about 50% missed it. It was doing what sometimes happens on these AP tests, where they give you 3 questions around a stimulus. The first 2 are about the stimulus in the time period. And then the third does something like, what is this most like in the future? They do this a lot with Japan, because the pattern you see in Japanese history from this era of global tapestry is they learn from the big brother next to them. So like Chinese dynastic patterns. China had an emperor, Japan had an emperor. He becomes a figurehead, the shogun's more powerful, but they attempted to have the same kind of thing. So this map shows the spread of Chinese ideas into Japan. For instance, the Japanese script is a form of Chinese script. The letters look the same, but they mean different things. Okay. So if that's the pattern happening in this Japanese constitution, Chinese influences, the future historical thing that is like the Japanese borrowing from another culture is this last one, the Meiji Restoration. Because these other 3 are the Japanese isolating themselves and trying to prevent foreign influence. But this image here shows a very European looking Japanese court, because in 1868, the emperor regains power over the shoguns to modernize Japan, to industrialize it, to become Western, and to start building an imperial power like the other imperialists in the 1800s. So that connection of Japan borrowing from China and now Japan borrowing from the West. That's what that question was alluding to. It's hard to lecture with a mask on. You get out of breath early, easy. Deep breath. All right. Second unit, networks of exchange. The title of this is pretty self-explanatory about what the pattern is that you're supposed to be learning about. It's about 3 trade routes, the peoples who dominate the routes, and then the effect of this connectivity. So lots of stuff on the screen, and you're like, what the bleep is all that stuff? So let's break it down. The main historical trade route of the Silk Roads, land-based trade in Asia, the water-based companion of connections via the sea in Asia, and then one that brings sub-Saharan Africa on the west side and connects it to the rest of Eurasia. The Indian Ocean trade routes connect East Africa. The Trans-Saharan over the Saharan Desert connects Ghana, Mali, West Africa to Islamic North Africa. So if it's about connections, You think it's about exchange of goods, which it kind of is, but more importantly, it's about the exchange of other things like religions, technology, and then consequentially, the Black Death. And then the great peoples that connect these are the Mongols because they take over the Silk Road. And then they take over the eastern terminus of the Indian Ocean trade when they conquer China. And then the western terminus in the Arab lands or Middle East. So networks of exchange. Remember Mongols, remember Black Death, remember trade routes. What else spreads that's important to future culture from China to Europe along the Silk Roads? It's on this graphic, but it's hard to see on a small screen.
Gunpowder?
Yes, gunpowder. And then it says paper, but you also want to think not just paper, but the idea of the printing press. Okay. And then I think one little detail that sometimes I see pop up on AP tests about the Indian Ocean trade is how it's not dominated by one people. It's kind of a, I don't want to say an agreement, but it's a shared burden. Arabs along the coast of Africa, then South Asians in the middle, and then the Chinese in the east. And what that creates is, and you see these little dots everywhere that look like on maps, those location. These are Arab ports on the African coast, and they're called the Swahili people because it's a mixture of things African and things Arab. In Malaysia, you have Chinese settlements. So you have Malay Chinese communities, because in this era, trade is usually between either ethnic cousins or co-religionists. You got to trust the people on each end of trade that could take a year. And if you have the same God, then you believe in the same punishments for theft, larceny, lying, stuff like that. So that phrase diasporic comes from the word dispersal, is the dispersal of people along trade routes. It's how Islam gets to southern India, Arab merchants, into Bangladesh. It's how things Chinese are all over Southeast Asia. My mother-in-law is Thai, but she's a quarter Chinese because that quarter of her genealogy were Chinese merchants in these diasporic communities. So to me, this is the easiest unit to understand because it's just about the diffusion of people and ideas and goods. It's the companion to global tapestry because you learn about the states all over the place. And in this, you learn about the connections, with the Mongols being the great connector because they destroy the states in between and create one world and spread the Black Death. Yay, Mongols. Okay. So a question you had about this was hard because of this image you were reading. It was what was called a caravanserai image. You should see the word caravan in the middle of it. And a caravan is overland trade and large processions of camels, horses, whatever, along the Silk Road. Okay. There's ruins of these things, and they literally are just rest stops along the Silk Road. These are all these dots. And they make this trading possible because you have to trade from water hole to water hole. You have to get from point A water to point B water. And the importance of these things, caravan stops, is that some of these develop into cities that still exist. Like Samarkand is one, Kashgar, these points along the Silk Road that develop into cities because they're connected to this spread of goods, ideas, and people. So the question was, that you guys missed, number 6, was these caravanserai are like all of the following except, and you're going to notice a pattern. The most missed are always these except questions. because they make you slow down in your reading. Okay. These are trade cities, Arab and African. Gujarat is a region in South Asia that Muslims settle in modern day Pakistan because it's trade. Malacca is a city that develops as a port along the Straits of Malacca, the only way China gets to India. You could say they could go around, but they would get lost. You want to sight land the entire time as much as possible. So these three have something in common. This doesn't. So it's a process of elimination game a lot on these accept questions. Baghdad was the capital of an empire, not a trade city first. It becomes a trade city as a capital, but it's about the genesis of these. Trade means these exist. This exists because an empire builds it as its capital. Okay. So we're on to 3. So 3 probably was right around Christmas of your freshman year, winter breakish, and then after. So this is when you're starting to remember things. You're getting more conscious high school habits. You're figuring myself and Miss Valier out a little more. The descriptor is pretty on point. Another way this unit is called is it's sometimes called gunpowder empires. So because of those linkages in Unit 2 of Chinese gunpowder and technology making its way west, large states are going to develop the Ottoman Empire, Safavid, Mughal, the Qing, Russia, because they integrate that technology and expand. So this question at the bottom was one we used the entire unit to study the art, the literature, the politics. So you should remember this consolidate and legitimize verb. I think there was a DVQ about evaluate the extent to which early modern rulers legitimized and consolidated their authority. And the answer is these 3 things. From a humanities angle, we talked about the bottom one. These rulers in these states would patronize great works of art and architecture, like the Mughal Taj Mahal, the French Palace of Versailles, Russia's St. Basil's Cathedral, the Ottoman Blue Mosque. Why would they make these things? What does that have to do with consolidating and legitimizing? What do you think? Come on, Zoom world.
Kind of to say that this is this empire's place, and here's proof why we're here.
Yeah. It's, hey, average human, look at this gigantic palace I can build and you can't. Look at how my palace is bigger than my neighbor's rivaling empire's palace. Size matters. Ornateness. In European art, this was the Baroque era, where it's about ornateness, decoration, and wealth. The Catholic Church acting as a state, also creating St. Peter's Cathedral and all these Renaissance works. So sometimes it's using belief systems, building a religious structure to show yourself as the defender of that faith, connecting your rule to some kind of divine connection. The crown's on my head, not yours, because God put it on mine, not yours. And then sometimes creating a class of elites, whether it's elite soldiers like the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, or bureaucrats, the scholar gentry of China, the intendants of Louis XIV, the zamindars in South Asia and the Mughal. Okay. So it's not a hard lesson or unit to kind of understand the pattern, because it's the pattern of large conquering empires and the way they keep control. So we looked at art and architecture. One of the questions you had was looking at these Safavid miniature portraits. Last year we looked at like the Forbidden City and a Smiling Fane at the Forbidden City, built by the Qing and the Ming and the Qing to justify their rule. Palace of Versailles, Taj Mahals. So this work was paired with this on the test. Louis XIV, absolute monarch in France. He's pictured here as kind of semi-divine, rays coming behind his head in a chariot of horses with angels, kind of connecting himself to these ideas of the divine. He's actually supposed to be representing Apollo, the Greek god here, even though they're not worshiping Greek mythology in France in this age. But it's all that kind of visual propaganda. Same kind of thing here. This is a Persian Shah levitating, being portrayed as an ancient pre-Islamic Persian king. The style of this, it's uniting all kinds of diverse styles of his large empire that he conquered. Usually Islamic art doesn't show people. That prohibition against images, because if you're creating images of something living, then you're being godlike. This is an Islamic state showing people, but it also has some of those Islamic patterns of repetitive nature. It also looks very Chinese color scheme. Okay. So you have a monarch here using ancient mythology, a monarch here using ancient mythology, and then combining the influences of Greece and Rome and Christianity, combining the influences of ancient Persia, Islam, and neighboring China. So here's the question that you guys missed, number 10. If an historian is researching and looking at source 2, which of these answer choices would be most applicable to that goal? And source 2 is the looking at the past, using non-Islamic traits to unite a diverse population of Persians, Muslims. So it's this bad boy, B. None of these others there's any evidence for. There's nothing about a rivalry between two states. There's no warfare being shown. There's nothing Islamic in the work at all. And there's no tribute collection necessarily. So notice process of elimination is going to get you to a lot of these answers. So unit 4, sometimes a better way to think of this as a companion to unit 3 is calling it maritime empires, mar being the Latin for sea. But they named it transoceanic interactions instead, because a big emphasis here is going to be about the impact of these connections through the seas by Europeans. Remember, the dates matter. Why is this the date for this one? Because it's the idea of 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But really it's 1432, the Portuguese did too. West Africa, South Africa, 1498, India, 1500s, China. Okay, so transoceanic interactions, age of exploration, Columbian exchange, transatlantic slave trade. Those are the big parts of this one. This was, I think this was right before COVID shutdown, and during it is when we were here. So this is what you ended the year with. So I know I have it ordered this way, but it's only because of this one was bigger. But discovery of the Americas led to conquest of the native empires, right? And then the first thing that the conquistador on the right does, this dude, is he tries to make the conquered natives like his European serf, his contractual obligated laborer, to make money and wealth. But Native Americans die off to European diseases. So European conquistadors, colonists, have to replace the labor with African slavery and what's called the Atlantic system. So another key point to remember about, and that, I'm sorry, backing up a second, that European use of the native as labor was called the encomienda. So the encomienda will be replaced by Atlantic slavery. The image down here is a encomienda. You got the native laborers, the conquistador, the conqueror, the use of Christianity replacing the native faith, and in the port to ship the goods out. When the native laborers die off, they're replaced with African slaves, and then you'd have what looks like a plantation, because that's what a plantation develops from, the encomienda system, the African replacing the American. One key thing to remember in this is the role sugar plays. What do you remember about sugar's importance? What does it have to do with slavery?
Weren't there a lot of sugar plantations in South America?
Yeah, Haiti, the Caribbean, and South America. It was the driver of Atlantic slavery. It was the stimulant, the stimulus, not like taking sugar, but the production of sugar. You guys from 8th grade focus on cotton, because cotton was North America. But the vast majority of slaves are traded to the Caribbean and Latin America, because sugar drove that economy. Haiti was once the richest colonial society with the most slaves, because it produced most of the world's sugar for a time. And that's why you'll have the Haitian slave revolt, because of the brutal conditions of sugar manufacturing and growing. And just the sheer numbers of slaves in the Caribbean and in Brazil versus what you would have in the American South. So Atlantic system, encomienda. So the first question to touch on that also touches on this that you need to remember, mercantilism. So mercantilism is the economic system that's the companion of colonialism, the political system. So in 1450 to 1750, this is the dominant economic system. What is it? It's all about the mother country restricting the colonies, making them dependent on them. There is no foreign trade because you want to keep wealth within that colonial loop. The colony provides cheap raw materials. The mother country takes those cheap raw materials, sells higher price manufactured goods back to the colonies. So the flow of wealth is to the mother country. The cartoon on the left, the colonies are the servants. The mother country is the glutton receiving the benefits of the colonies. It's a closed system. Wealth is supposed to accrue in the mother country. And that's what this passage is talking about up here. It's an Englishman talking about entering this colonial gain will keep wealth in our treasury. So if you look at the question that's up there, it's one of those examples again of first two on the stimulus will be about the document and the time period. The third will bridge it to another time period. So if this was the system being described in the document, these will undermine it later. If you think about the American Revolution and all the Latin American revolutions, it's trying to disrupt this system. It wants to keep the wealth in the colonies by getting rid of the mother country's dominance. So when colonialism goes away in the New World, mercantilism is replaced with capitalism, free trade, free enterprise, country to country, no interlocking domination of a mother country. And of course, the other big transoceanic pattern is the Columbian Exchange. You don't have to know all these individual products. It's kind of redundant. A couple that matter, the potato from the old world, from the new world to the old. What it's going to do to the old world is it's going to drastically make population skyrocket. When the potato gets to China, population pressures alone become almost modern with so many Chinese, because the potato is something that can grow on marginal farmland, land that could never be farmed before. And the other way around to the Americas, I think I'd remember something like smallpox, because that's what the question you had was about. So number 16 was the third in this image showing a Native American dying of smallpox from a Native American artist's perspective. And the questions about the Columbian Exchange. Notice the accept again, you're missing accept ones. All these other answers are talking about the effects of these exchanges, whereas this one is showing about a process that develops after the fact. Taking European sugar, because West or Old World sugar, implanting it in the New World, and then taking African laborers to manufacture it. It's almost the inverse flow of the Columbian Exchange, not the same as these flows. So this was a hard question. It was the most missed, because you would associate this with the time period, Atlantic slavery, the plantation economy, but it's not this flow of exchanges. It goes backwards. Okay. So the last little part of transoceanic interactions is what's happening in the Old World with European exploration and what's developing, or what's called a trading post empire. European companies, the joint stock company, the charter company, like the EIC, the VOC, they don't move in wholesale in this time period, conquer old empires. They set up ports called trading posts that connect their voyages around Africa. Why? Because they have to stop for water. While they're there, they trade. Why don't they conquer? This isn't the era, 1450 to 1750, where Europeans outgun these places yet. Because remember, the Mughal are a gunpowder empire. The Qing are a gunpowder empire. We don't have Europeans, my ancestors, can't beat the Mughals on land, can't beat the Qing on land yet. So they establish trading posts on the periphery. And then Europeans compete amongst themselves to have posts in these different places. So the question you had was about this passage, talking about the competition between the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese in Asia. And the question was this: effect of the process reflected in the document. The competition and open warfare between European powers in Asia makes some Asian states decide that they don't want these Europeans near them, and they restrict them. This is a picture of the Japanese outlawing Christianity and persecuting Christians in their country under the Tokugawa. The Chinese setting up only certain cities where all European nations had a factory, a place that they would gather goods, and it would be regulated by the Chinese. So in 1450 to 1750, the Tokugawa and the Ming, and later the Qing, restrict access to foreigners. Because in 1450 to 1750, they're of equitable power to Europeans. They're not going to start losing, they meaning the Japanese and the Chinese, until the 1800s, post 1750. You might ask, why post 1750? Because that's what Unit 5 is about, these revolutions that turn the tide, that change the relationship between Europe and the rest of the world. That relationship is first through the revolutions. Colonial relationships are ended. And the idea flow that I have on the left is the ideas of the European philosophical enlightenment, bringing up ideas of liberty, rights, balance of power. They will influence all these revolutions that try to put those ideas into constitutional governments. Later, those same kind of ideas on liberty will lead to thinking about abolition, feminism, and suffrage. But probably the more impactful revolution is the Industrial Revolution, which is why these dates are kind of picked. Another way to think about naming this unit is the phrase, the Great Divergence. I'll type it in the chat. Economic historians use that term for this time period. So look at that graph that I have on there in the rectangle around Industrial Revolution. What great divergence do you see happening? Divert is where divergence comes from. What dynamic is shifting? Let's
Who
hear
has the highest GDP?
Say it again.
Who has the highest GDP?
And so how is it changing?
Oh, it goes mostly from China and India to the
Right.
West.
Right. So this is the divergences, the traditional economic powerhouses swapping with the West. So then the hypothesis is it's because of this. Because if that's when it's happening, and that's when you're seeing global productivity shift from the West, from the East to the West, then the Industrial Revolution must be the cause. And then over here in the modern era is when you see China and India starting to go up again as they industrialize later. Okay. So one of the questions you had about the revolution also ties in the Industrial Revolution. It was the Haitian Revolution passage by Toussaint Louverture, arguing towards the French government to keep slavery ended. But we know slavery doesn't end. And something that seems oxymoronic, if the Industrial Revolution is happening and work is more mechanized, if labor is going from human to machine, then why does slavery actually grow in the 1800s? And the answer is when they mechanize the production of textiles, they increase the demand of a need for cotton. And the first Industrial Revolution is in England, and it's in textile factories making cloth. And when you increase the demand for the raw material, it increases the demand for the slaves to work the land. So one little invention that you hopefully learned about in 8th grade, the cotton gin, actually spurs slavery and increases it throughout the 1800s. Whereas most economists thought industry would make slavery irrelevant because that's what happened in the northern states. But the northern states needed the raw material supplied by the South. The British factories needed the raw material supplied through slavery. So then the rest of Unit 5 is about the spread of industrialization from England through the continent to Russia to the United States, and some elements towards the Ottoman Empire and then Japan. It doesn't show in this graphic industrialization spreading to India. India was the great textile and iron producer. The passage you got here was about how British industrialization was altering relationships with India. And I think this image shows this divergence. Traditional textile production done by hand in India, done by machines in Europe. How? Because the power source is replaced. Human labor to machine, the steam engine. Okay. So you had this question with this strange person in a dress. What this was showing is workers revolting and burning a factory down. This was a cartoon character, a fake person who was kind of propaganda for the crazy factory worker wearing dresses, burning down their place of employment. Like, why would they do that? Because what it's showing is how industrialization's impact on the worker is not sometimes taken well because their world is being shifted from living in the countryside to living in the city, from being more in control of their own day through the rhythms of nature to now being on a factory time clock, from being someone who could produce the product from beginning to end, have a craft, from now just being a cog in a machine. You go from making the whole shoe to just lacing the shoe. And that has a result or a reaction in the workers who organize against those abuses in what are called unions. So these are examples of major unions on this image in this country. Other major reactions, workers revolting, are Marxist ideas. Workers of the world unite. That's what this big bearded guy is up here. So this image about workers revolting is similar to socialist ideas about discontent with the capitalist world order and what it does to the worker. So the non-industrial parts of the world try to catch up. This is representing a reform in the Ottoman Empire, and then the aptly named self-strengthening movement in the Qing. To resist industrialization, we need to strengthen ourselves. Another reaction or change brought about by industrialization is women work in factories. They go from private familial jobs to public jobs. And in those places who industrialize first, women's rights eventually increase through the right to vote. What freaked everybody out last period is they noticed this date. That's Saudi Arabia. Not industrialized, not part of the spread of industrialization. And that's the very late sequencing of women's rights. So industrialization not only changes the way that goods are produced, but there's effects on gender or social relations. So I'm showing you this and it's in the slideshow. If I had one tool with me that I wanted to review the most, it would be this thing I put together about unit 5 and 6, because it looks at how industrialization is the stimulus for imperialism and then resistance to the West. How industrialism creates workers' movements that are radical about upending the capitalist industrialist system. And it goes to different regions and different movements. So I'm not going to read it to you. You can go back and look at it, but think of it as kind of causes and effects as you move from the left to the right. So that's what unit 6 is, the consequences of industrialization. If unit 5 is industrialization, unit 6 is the consequences of it. So to make sure other people are awake, besides Nina and Nina, the Nina sisters, on this map, tell me what patterns are being shown that are effects of industrialization. Crickets. So we had a Nyla sighting earlier. We had a Michaela. We have a Sharv in the chat. Immigration. I would refer to it more as migration, right? Because you have people migrating from agricultural societies to industrial societies. Agricultural societies to places that are producing the raw materials to feed the factories. So there's one outcome. Look at all the British flags. What's another consequence of industrialization that the British flags represent? I see Ruby barely awake. What do you think, Ruby? She's like, screw you. Say the idea in the chat or in on the mic so people at home can hear you and the video can hear you.
This might be dumb, but colonization.
But what do we call it in the 1800s to differentiate it from like the British colonization of the Americas? Imperialism, right. So think of industrialization, I, imperialism, I, cause and effect. the mechanized countries can now conquer the non-mechanized countries. The British can conquer the Mughal. Mughal, not mechanized, British mechanized. Now the Qing aren't conquered, but notice all the foreign flags in China. They're dividing it up because mechanized and not. Remember that graphic novel where you looked at how they tried to develop a navy, but the Navy still got it butt kicked by the British because they might have built it with foreign experts, but they couldn't maintain it because they weren't a mechanized industrial society. Now remember, the Japanese become one. So they don't get done Chinese. They can do to the Chinese what they didn't want done to them. And they start in Korea and then in China. So two big consequences: global migrations and imperialism. It's a pretty easy unit to kind of structurally think about what it's about. So on the migration one, you guys missed this question. The left was the image you got showing migration of Northern Europeans to the industrial East Coast of the United States or to Australia, but then the continued migration of coerced laborers, because imperialism still allows for the domination of one people by another to feed the factories, to feed the West. So modern migration patterns are different. If you look at from the 1800s, this is European migration in the United States, mirroring this. When we get to the now, you see the migrations are from the developing world to the developed. So that's sometimes a phrase called the southernization. Migration goes from the south to the north in the modern era. Easy to think about when you look at southern border kind of issues. Central America coming to North America. Africans coming to Europe. That's the kind of trends of migrations happening today. So reactions to imperialism is the next great topic of Unit 6. So this was the source for questions 39 and 40. This was a Indian, I know it says Al-Afghani, but they just call him that, arguing against rejecting Western science. Because remember, there's a pull in this era to be like the West so you don't get kicked butt by the West. So he's arguing, let's do that. Let's adopt modern teachings. This question is by someone, or this question is saying, okay, accept which of these movements is similar to this idea of taking Western ideas to improve yourself. The Meiji Restoration is the industrialization and Westernization of Japan. Self-strengthening is a failed movement that tries to modernize China. Tanzimat reforms are constitutional reforms in the Ottoman Empire to modernize. Even if you had no idea what a Wahhabist was, you could process of elimination figure it out. What a Wahhabist is, it's one of the original Islamic fundamentalist groups that are opposing imperialism. This is the founder. He grew up in Saudi Arabia before there was a Saudi Arabia. He notices that the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Empire, is shrinking, while European empires are all over the damn place. So he wants to reject the West because he sees its power increasing. 9/11 was done by a philosophical ancestor of this movement who called themselves Wahhabists, and he was the original philosopher of their movement, so to speak, because it's an attack on the West for being in Saudi Arabia in 2000 and in 2001. So the second question, number 40, was asking you to read the second paragraph and match it to a modern movement. And if you're rejecting science, then it's kind of like in that Jihad versus McWorld reading, that idea of holding close to your traditions because you fear the other. Conservative, violent response to globalization. This, 9/11, is similar to this passage and this movement in the 17 and 1800s. All right. So here's where it gets easy. What we just did. Unit 7, World Wars. Duh. The part that's difficult about this unit is when it goes into the years between the wars, called the interwar period. And what you just need to remember is it's all about the Great Depression and comparing how different governments react to that global economic disaster. How do they react? All governments take a greater role in economic life. It's easy to understand with the Soviet Union. A communist economy owns everything, plans everything, distributes everything. Oops. A fascist economy, Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, they want the state to be not necessarily the designer of everything, but they want all economic output to benefit the state and the military. So they de-emphasize workers' rights. They de-emphasize corporate profit for the benefit of the state. In the United States, in Western Europe, the beginnings of what will later be called the welfare state are created, where the government creates agencies to directly employ people, to provide benefits to people, like Social Security is born in this era. Social Security is old age payments, basically. This all comes about because of the economy not being able to regulate itself during the Great Depression. So the government steps in. Different ways of stepping in, but they all do it. So the question you had was this image here, showing a critic of this movement of governments getting involved, the Roosevelt economy, the New Deal. He's thrown overboard. It's the shipwreck for trying to do too much. Why was he trying to do too much? Because in the Great Depression, almost a quarter of the people in the United States were unemployed. Economy grinds to a halt. So governments respond by getting more involved in the economy. In economic theory, that's called Keynesian theory. And it's pretty simple, confusing chart because it's an economic speak, but every one of your families, unless you're really wealthy, just got a couple stimulus payments from the government. Why do they call them stimulus payments? What's the government trying to do? What do you think? If you're stimulating something, what are you doing? So Sean says you're stimulating the economy. How are you stimulating it? How does giving everybody money stimulate it?
So they
Because
can.
now they have-
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
they
Vamsi.
can,
I saw you pop on first. Sorry.
they can buy more stuff. They
Yeah.
have no more money.
In this phrase here, aggregate demand is this idea that Keynes had that if the government takes your tax dollars, your money to begin with, gives them back to you, then you're going to spend it. And if you spend it, then you're going to create demand for products. And if there's demand for the product, then industry will have to supply more of it. And to supply more, they'll have to produce more. To produce more, they got to hire more people. And that initial government stimulus will make the pie grow for everybody over time. That's the idea. That idea starts with the Great Depression. And you still see it today in things like stimulus payments. Okay. Fuel the rocket. Yes, Sharv. So World War II question. It's going to lead us into the decolonization topic. You see Japanese flags. You see European flags. Japanese propaganda during World War II was that the Japanese were going to free the Asians from the European. Scared American. Okay. Except question again. There's no negotiation happening to kick out Europeans. The Japanese are conquering. They start with Korea and they keep trucking. Okay. But this phrase, colonies negotiated their independence, is important because it is one of the two types of decolonization. So this is an important little graphic here because it's got things to remember about decolonization. Ghana and India are shown as the two examples of relatively peaceful negotiated independence from the colonial master. Ghanaians, Indians, Pakistanis, they're not going to war against Great Britain. There's violence in the form of protest and things, but it's not warfare. In other places, they have to fight the colonizer. The Vietnamese have to kick the French out. Kenya has to kick the British out. Angola has to kick the Portuguese out. And the Algerians have to kick the French out through war. So there's negotiated independence. There's violent independence. Remember, Ghana and India are always the examples of peaceful. These guys are the examples of violent, where the Europeans don't want to go. Okay, so that's what this question was about. Which one of these is not like Algeria? The document was the Algerian National Front. Last unit, globalization, I think you guys get just from that Macworld pros and cons stuff, but another subtopic of it is the new modes of technology that revolutionize the world. And then advances that change the world because they prevent the plagues of old. Vaccinations, medication, treatments, I guess until last spring. But now it's back. The Fauci ouchie is saving us all. So the question you guys missed about it, I think mostly was because of this confusing graphic. Because it's kind of inverse from what you normally see. Time is on the left. And then numbers of children or fertility rates are on the right. And then it shows you that over time, all societies at different rates are having less and less children. And what that represents is a shift from agricultural societies to industrial societies. Agricultural societies need more children because they work on the farm. Industrial societies don't because they don't work in the factory no more. Children are actually a burden. You burdensome children in industrial societies because you don't produce your food. You consume it from my paycheck, where you'd be out there in the fields in the good old days, shucking your own corn, milking your own cow. So what this trend is showing is over time, some at a slower rate than others, number of children go down. And you could say this drastic drop in China that pops in here is because they actually have a one-child policy that would kind of do that, right? But it's when they're trying to become less agricultural and more industrial. And ta-da, that was it. So that was longer than I've talked all year consecutively. And now when I'll stop the recording.